Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to review the V90S. This is a new clamshell handheld from PowKiddy, and an upgrade to the original V90, which came out like 4 years ago, so it's been a while. And it's a pretty big jump from the original V90 over to the V90S. The original could only play like up to Super Nintendo and Game Boy Advance, and it even struggled with some of those games. Now, the V90S that we're reviewing here today is a lot more powerful. This has a chipset we've seen before, and it can play your kind of standard fare under $100. So it's going to be able to play up through PS1 and then a smattering of those other systems. Now, we've got a lot of options when it comes to clamshells under $100. And so in this video, I want to talk about the difference between all of them and where this one might fit. And it really comes down to PowKiddy as a company because, you know, they often will focus on the cheaper side of things, both in terms of price, but then also sometimes in quality. And the way I like to put it is that, you know, PowKiddy will make something that's a little bit cheaper than the others, but also a little bit worse. And in this video, I want to talk about whether or not that balance actually is going to work this time around. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Now the specs here are definitely not surprising. The CPU that we're looking at is the Allwinner A133 Plus. That's the exact same chipset we've seen in other devices like the TrimUI Smart Pro as well as the TrimUI Brick. And the performance here is going to be a little bit worse than the Anbernic XX devices that we've seen over the past couple of years that are also very budget-minded. It really comes down to the fact that everything from PS1 and below will play fine, and then other systems like Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, PSP, they will work okay, but you'll have to be very picky about which games can actually run. We've got a standard amount of RAM, 1 GB, and like with a lot of these other cheaper handhelds, it doesn't have any internal storage. You would just use microSD cards. The display here is also very standard, 3.5 inches with a resolution of 640 by 480 and an aspect ratio of 4:3. The battery here is 3000 milliamp hours, and I found this gives me around 4 hours average battery life, depending on what I'm playing. If I play Game Boy, I can get upwards of 8 hours, but you know, if I'm really pushing it with like PS1 and beyond, then yeah, it's going to be 4 hours or less. Now, as far as connectivity, we don't have a lot going on here other than the fact that we have a USB-C OTG port. That means we can plug in a USB Wi-Fi dongle and Bluetooth and get our connectivity that way. It comes with a version of Predecessor right out of the box, so this is a Linux-based operating system. And really, the only other point worth noting is that it is a very cheap handheld. The retail price from PowKiddy themselves is $40. Now, as soon as they announced the V90S, I picked up this yellow one right here, but in my box, it also came with a second model. And so this is one of those things that's kind of weird, but PowKiddy knows my address. And so when they see me order something, they usually will throw in extras for review. So I've been messing with my yellow model for the past couple weeks, but let's take a look at this one here and do a quick unboxing. They've got a bunch of colors listed here on the box, but as far as I can tell, only these four are actually for sale. They've got a transparent black, the gray one we'll look at right now, the yellow one that I bought, and then also a red one, which looks more like this orange that you can see here. I kind of wish that they did make a black and white handheld. I think that would look pretty cool. Not a lot inside the box, just a V90S instruction manual, which just has, you know, things like hotkeys. And then we have our USB-A to USB-C charging cable. Other than that, we just have the device. So a couple first impressions about this device is, number one, it actually feels pretty solid. You know, PowKiddy is sometimes known for making pretty cheap products, but this one actually feels pretty well made. The plastic texture here is slightly matte, but not very much. I would say it's kind of in between being matte and slippery. So I think it still feels pretty good, but does have a bit of a cheaper quality to it. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. It kind of reminds me of an older Nintendo device, and so in that regard, I don't think it's that bad. The hinge itself is surprisingly solid. We've got this larger hinge right here, and then this other one on this side. This is the same design as the Game Boy Advance SP, as well as the Anbernic handhelds. And yeah, it feels very good. A lot better than, say, for example, the Miyoo Flip. I feel like this one isn't going to have any issues. It's a nice light hinge that I feel will work for a long time. And my third takeaway was that it's surprisingly large for a clamshell handheld. I was thinking it would be exactly the size of a Game Boy Advance SP, but it is not. Let's do a quick size comparison. So here's a line of cheaper clamshell handhelds. We've got the Game Boy Advance SP, Miyoo Flip, Anbernic RG3 4XX SP, the PowKiddy V90S that we're reviewing today, and then finally the Anbernic RG3 5XX SP. Now all three of these handhelds feel basically identical in size, and this is my preferred size. They are basically the same as the Game Boy Advance SP. They feel really good. So in terms of pocketability, these three are my favorite. Now these two are larger and almost identical in size of their own. So it's basically like a clone of the RG35XX SP because these are very, very similar. Now between that Game Boy Advance SP size and the PowKiddy V90, the difference is slight, but it's mostly having to do with the overall width. And it does make it a little bit harder to pocket. It's also a little bit thicker as well, not by much. I would really say it's the width that makes the bigger difference. So here's the way I see it. I prefer the pocketability of this size, but I also like the roominess of this one. There's a lot of people who actually prefer the roominess of one of these bigger handhelds. If I had to pick just one handheld to be my everyday carry option in terms of clamshells, it would be this Miyoo Flip. And that's because this one has that same 3.5-inch display, but also that smaller form factor and the addition of analog sticks. So this one I feel is more versatile and also just gives me like a smaller compact form to be able to throw in my pocket. My big issue with this one is the hinge, which I think is unreliable. And so that's why I have a hard time recommending this one, even though I think just in terms of size and controls, it's my favorite. And so this one has a sturdier hinge, I would say, compared to that Miyoo Flip, but it's still just a little bit bigger. So really the best comparison that I can say here is with that Anbernic RG35XX SP. These are still great handhelds and really nice and pocketable, but I do wish that it was a little bit less bulky and closer to that true Game Boy Advance size, because once you actually put a Game Boy Advance in your pocket, you can see that there is quite a big difference between the two. And so yes, this one has the same size as the Anbernic RG35XX SP. It's not an uncomfortable handheld. In fact, having that additional bulk does make it a little bit more comfortable to hold while you're actually playing it, but it's not quite as slim and as pocketable as some of the other options that we have. Now, the way I want to frame this video is to talk about how this one is different from the other clamshells, because they are all very similar, but there are some selling points to this one and a bunch of caveats as well. And first and foremost, this has a $40 retail price. I mean, PowKiddy has it listed for $45, but directly on their sales page, they have a $5 off coupon. So I'm considering this to be a $40 handheld. They are asking a little bit of shipping for US customers, but for everyone else, I think it is free shipping. So right off the bat, we are talking about a device that retails for cheaper than the other more modern clamshell options. I mean, the other ones usually start at around $60, sometimes $70, $80, whereas this one's starting at $40, which means that once we see sales and whatnot, we're probably going to see this for even cheaper. And it's very similar to the original V90 in that regard, because this guy used to sell for $40 as well, but then we often would see sales making it, $30, $20 sometimes. And so that's kind of what I'm expecting with this one, is that it's a lot cheaper than the other options, but still has very similar performance. So right off the bat, I think that the price point is a big draw right here. If you're able to get this for a lot cheaper and it does all the things that you want, then why wouldn't you get it? At that point, this may be half the price of some of the other options. The other point that makes this one unique is that it has rubber membrane controls, like your traditional controls you would find on other devices, as opposed to clicky buttons, which you will find on the other clamshells. So this is kind of neat in the fact that it gives you those full-size controls as opposed to something very clicky. Number one, they have a nostalgic kind of feeling to them, a little bit charming, and then also they're a lot quieter than the other ones too. They're basically silent. The only exception is going to be like the select and start buttons, which are micro switchy and are louder than the other ones. So it's a weird dichotomy here where you have these really nice quiet buttons, but the moment you press start and select, you're like, oh man, this thing's actually pretty loud. So it is a little bit weird. Like, I kind of wish that they had just used rubber membranes for these buttons as well to make the whole thing just very seamless. Now, one thing worth noting is the D-pad actually lacks pivot. So it does have some pivot to it, but not as much as I would like. And when you press down on the D-pad all the way, it almost bottoms out with the shell. Not to the point of actually bottoming out, but enough that it feels a little bit more mushy than some of the other D-pads that we have in other handhelds. So I would say just from the overall feel of the D-pad, it's not perfect, but it still definitely gets the job done. When it comes to practical usage, I found that it worked just fine with the Contra test. This is where I pressed in on the D-pad and then rock it left and right. And yes, when I rock it just a little bit, it does not move the character, but if I push it all the way one side or the other, it does. And so for me, that's about where I want it in terms of sensitivity. And so I found no false diagonals when I'm playing with this D-pad. On the other hand, we have the Street Fighter test where I try to hit a diagonal, and this also worked out really really well. So no problems with Hadoukens and Shoryukens. I would say this is a very easy D-pad to use. My only hesitation is that it does feel a little bit mushy when you push it down all the way, just because it nearly bottoms out with the rest of the panel. But other than that, I've got no complaints about these controls. I think they work really well. And so that is one differentiating factor, in that these are rubber membrane buttons and they feel actually very decent. The face buttons in particular are really nice to use. They are light to the touch, so I feel like I could use these all day. I really like this feel. The shoulder and trigger buttons on the back are also pretty good. These are dampened micro switches, so they still have that kind of clicky sound, especially with the triggers, but they are a little bit softened as well. Let me give you a listen. So the triggers are a little bit louder than I would like, but the shoulder buttons are fine, and both of them are still quieter than the actual start and select buttons, which I think are just too loud. Another thing that makes this one different from its contemporary options is that it does not have built-in Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. Now, like I mentioned before, it does have an OTG port, which means that if you have a USB dongle and then like a Wi-Fi or Bluetooth adapter like this one, you can just plug it in and it'll connect to your Wi-Fi. And to be honest, because it's a clamshell, you don't really see this one when it's plugged in. So you just kind of have it here and you're playing, and then you might remember in the back, oh yeah, I've got this thing going. So when it comes to actual practical use, it actually works out pretty well, but it's really going to be whether or not you want to spend the additional money to get one of these Bluetooth or Wi-Fi dongles. So the way I've been using it is if I need to get on the internet, for example, I really want to unlock some retro achievements, or maybe I want to download a new theme like you can see here with my operating system, then those are things that you can do with the Wi-Fi dongle. Now, one thing worth noting is that scraping is limited in the operating system that comes with this device. Even when connected to Wi-Fi, your only option is going to be the arcade database as opposed to the games database or screen scraper, which is what people usually use. That means that if you try to scrape games, say for example from Sega Genesis, it's not going to show anything because it's pulling from an arcade database, which means that effectively, even with a Wi-Fi dongle, you cannot scrape box art with the stock operating system. Instead, your option would be to take out the micro SD card and scrape it offline. I've got an old video where I showed how to do that. I'll leave a link down below because the process really hasn't changed, but you'll need a Windows computer to do it. Now, another thing missing from the I/O on this device is a headphone jack. There's no headphone jack down here, which means you'll have to use the OTG adapter again. So if you've got USB-C headphones or a USB-C adapter, then yes, it'll work just fine. And I've seen confirmations from others that it does work. I don't have an adapter on me to test, but yeah, I've seen a bunch of videos showing that it does work. So it's just an additional layer of kind of annoyance or inconvenience, but yes, you can use headphones with this, but you'll need a USB-C adapter for it. And then one other thing this device lacks is hinge sleep. So on the other devices, they will have like magnets down here and then other magnets here, and then they'll sense when they come together, and that's going to put the device into sleep. But if you look here, when I close it up, it actually does not go to sleep at all. You see, if I'm opening it up just barely, it's just running the whole time. Now, the OS will turn itself off after like 5 minutes and it will put itself into sleep, but it's one of those things where, one of my favorite parts of a clamshell is being able to close it up when I'm ready to go and then just, open it up later and start it up. But unfortunately with this one, you will have to take the extra step of pressing the power button to put it to sleep first. Not the end of the world, but something to think about is that it's not quite as intuitive. And then finally, compared to the other devices, this one does lack some of the custom firmware options that we've seen. For example, the Anbernic devices have a ton of options. You can play things like Newly or MooOS on it, and those are all really well-refined operating systems. This one comes with Predecessor, which is a good operating system, so I have not had any problems actually just using this and getting in and out of my games. But if you want to try something else, there's not a lot of other options out there. We've got something called Plum OS, which is in the works. I'll leave it linked down below as well. So there's other options for now, but not compared to like the Anbernic devices right now. And I'm not sure if this device is going to be popular enough to see some of those other OS options. It is definitely possible. For example, this one has the same chipset as the TrimUI Brick and TrimUI Smart Pro, which are supported by Newly. So it might be something that we might see in the future, but I wouldn't hold your breath and definitely don't buy a device in case we see something better later on. But I will say that just from a practical and functional standpoint, the stock operating system for me has worked just fine. I've been able to download new themes. You can see right here, I've got the Art Book Next theme with the outline color scheme. And so I'm able to navigate through my games. Now, I don't have any box art because I wasn't able to scrape it. And I didn't actually take the time to do the offline scraping that I'll have linked down below. But that's the way that I would add box art to this. And so that's probably what I'll end up doing with this, is keeping this theme right here and then scraping my own box art offline. And then just kind of using it for the more simple systems, Game Boy, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, all the stuff that I actually end up playing on a clamshell like this. I did mention before, it is powerful enough to be able to play some Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 games, but also keep in mind it doesn't have analog sticks, so that might hamper the games that you're actually trying to play. So for my part, if I am going to play something like Dreamcast, I'm mostly just going to stick to the games that work with the D-pad out of the box. Something like a fighting game, Soul Calibur, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, those are all really good fits. Now, out of the box, the PowKiddy V90S will come with its own 16GB operating system card, but you can also purchase preloaded cards that'll have games on it as well. Now, it's going to cost you an additional $5, $10, depending on how big of a card you want, but for my part, I just bought the operating system card. Now, the interesting thing here is that as soon as I started up, I got an error that said basically, hey, we can't find any games or systems, so you can't actually do anything. You have to actually load a game first before you can even get into the operating system. It's going to give you the only option, which is to quit. And when you quit out of it, it's just going to rescan for games again. And when it sees that you don't have them, it's just going to take you back to the screen. And so if you're a newcomer and you buy this without an additional card, it might be a little bit confusing. So let me walk you through how to add your own games. Well, first you're going to need a microSD card. I would recommend about 64 gigabytes, maybe 128. It depends on how many disk-based games you want to play, because those have larger file sizes. But really, when it comes down to like the cartridge-based systems, 64 gigabytes is going to be way more than enough, and you can usually get these cards for about $10. Now, once you've got your microSD card, you want to put it in your computer. It's going to be blank, and then you need to add a couple folders so they're recognized with the OS. So the first folder is going to be called ROMs, all lowercase. After that, inside of the ROMs folder, make another folder. This can be basically anything you want that supports a system. For my example, I would recommend GB, lowercase, for Game Boy. And then from there, inside the Game Boy folder, put a Game Boy game. And that's all you have to do. Just put one in, because that's going to give you access to the full menu system. So then once you put your one Game Boy game on the microSD card and you put it inside of your device, you'll see this menu show up instead. It'll say Game Boy and it'll say one game underneath. Now, I've got a bunch of games on here because I added more later, but that at least gets you into the menu system when you press start. And once you're in the menu right here, go down to the system settings option and then go down to the bottom again and go into the front-end developer options. Now, it's kind of unclear what you have to do to get all the folders added to your device, but I can show you what I did, and I know that worked. So what I did is I went down here to format a disk, I selected that, and then under device to format, I changed that to the actual external. It'll show the actual storage size of your card. And then here under file system, I changed that to exFAT, then selected format now. Once that happened, I went back to this system, and then I selected clean game list and remove unused media. Once I had done that, I turned off the device, took out my microSD card, put it into my computer, and then in the ROMs folder, I had all of my different systems listed, NES, Super Nintendo, and whatnot. So I took all my ROMs and then I added them to there. And so that's how I got everything working. And so after that, this is what my device looked like. I was able to just navigate through all my different systems and then choose my game and launch them from here. Additionally, once I plugged in my Wi-Fi dongle, I was able to go into my network settings and then connect to my Wi-Fi. And then from there, I was able to download new themes onto the OS as well. And so that's what I did here under theme set. I've downloaded the Art Book Next one. And so now when I go back, this is what I've changed it to. If you want to have those nice colored system options, then you want to go into the system artwork here under theme configuration and change that to outline. After that, you will get this look right here, which I really like. And honestly, that's the majority of the configuration I did for this device. It was a very easy setup. Now, a couple tips and tricks about the OS. We'll start with the fact that this menu button doesn't seem to be mapped correctly. And so often with these other devices, you'll press menu and other buttons to make the hotkeys work, but they still haven't mapped to select with this OS, which means that this button doesn't really do anything. A good example here is going to be the brightness button. Usually you'll press menu and volume up and down to adjust the brightness, but that doesn't work on this device. Instead, it's the select button. So I'm pressing and holding select, and then I can press volume up and down, and that's going to adjust the brightness. And that's how it's going to be for all the hotkeys with this device. In order to exit a game, you'll press select and start twice, not menu and start, which is a little bit odd. Like this button doesn't really need to be there. Now, one thing worth noting is that some of these bezels are actually really well made. You can see here with Game Boy, when I started up a game, I have these Game Boy bezels on the left and right, which I think looks really good. And so overall, I think this is actually a pretty nice OS experience. Same thing with Game Boy Advance. You can see that it actually includes that Game Boy Advance bezel out of the box. So usually you have to like find and download and configure it, but they've done all that work for you, which I think is pretty great. So other than a couple minor things that you have to do to set up the operating system in terms of getting the card prepared, I think that it's actually a pretty nice solution. And of course, if you buy one of the prepaid cards, then it's going to already be configured and whatnot, so you don't have to worry about that as well. A couple other things worth noting, the screen here is pretty good, but it could be better. One of the things I noticed right off the bat is that we have this bezel here with then an additional bezel underneath. The Ambernic RG35XX was also like that, and so I'm not super surprised, but it is a little bit weird to have bezel on bezel. It feels like a little bit of a wasted space. Now, as far as the brightness and coloring and whatnot, I think it's pretty good here. This is max brightness right here. It's good enough to be able to play outdoors in most situations, but it's not the brightest screen I've seen at this price point. One of the nice things though is that it does get very dim. If I go all the way down, it's actually quite dim. You can barely see the logo here. So I think it's going to be a pretty good device to be able to play in the dark as well. The colors also look pretty good here. It's not the most saturated screen I've seen, but I think it still gets the job done. And the balance overall, I think, is good as well. It's a little bit on the greener or cooler side, but other than that, I don't really have any complaints about the screen as well, especially for a $40 handheld. As far as audio, I think it's pretty good here. This is a mono speaker, unlike the original, but I think it gets suitably loud and also is pretty clear. I also like the fact that I don't actually cover it with my hands while playing, so that's pretty good. Now, as far as high-end gameplay, you can play a smattering of PSP and Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 games, but your mileage may vary. I've never really found this chipset to be particularly good with PlayStation Portable, but if you're willing to go into settings and, adjust things like the frame skipping and whatnot, there are definitely some opportunities there to play PSP games. However, for my part, I think that playing a 16:9 system like PSP on a 4:3, 3.5-inch display is just a little bit too small, so this is not really my particular use case. As far as Dreamcast, I think it's a better experience just because it will have auto frame skip enabled by default, and it also matches the aspect ratio of the display. You will be limited by D-pad controls unless you go in and reconfigure them, so something to bear in mind. Now, Nintendo 64 is another system I don't really play on this handheld just because I don't have analog sticks, and most Nintendo 64 games did have analog controls, which means you'll have to go into RetroArch and remap them. I've shown that in my other Clamshell videos as well. It's just a matter of changing out the input methods so that the D-pad works as an analog stick. It's a workaround, and so personally I would just rather play D-pad-centric games. But really, the vast majority of games I've been testing over the past week with the PowKiddy V90S have been from those systems that actually really fit this control scheme. So I've been having a great time playing things like Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, NES, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis. Those are all the systems to me that are a perfect match for this clamshell form factor. Now, one of the neater things about the original V90 is that this one had a removable battery, and this is just like a full-on cell phone battery. You can just find these cheaply on Amazon or AliExpress, so it was a really easy replacement. One of my favorite things about this handheld was just how easy it was to replace the battery. Now, in removing the battery compartment, you can see it's just a typical battery that you would find for some of these handhelds. So unfortunately, it's not standardized in the way that it was with the V90, which again was one of my favorite things about it. Now, you can always replace these, but you would have to find something that matches the dimensions, or maybe just hope that PowKiddy would sell it to you directly. But as it stands right now, it's not going to be as easy to replace as the older model. Now, going further in here, I've now removed the back shell, and also I've taken the screws off the PCB and removed the speaker, so I am able to get to the board. You can see that this is where the chip is, so it's not actually facing the battery, but rather facing this part of the device. To be fair, I haven't really found this device to get very warm, and your hands don't really touch this spot either. So I think of all the places to get warm, this is probably one of the better places in a clamshell just because your fingers are not going to be touching it. So I haven't felt any unpleasant warmth while playing this device, even though the A133P is actually a pretty warm chip. Either way, I think from a repairability standpoint, this is actually pretty easy to get in and out of, so you can change out your buttons if you'd like, and stuff like that. You could also do a bit of modding if you'd like. For example, here are the micro switches for select and start. You could add a little bit of, say, for example, waterproof medicinal tape, and that's going to dampen this right here to make it not quite as loud. You could also do the same thing with the shoulder and trigger buttons. Add a little bit of tape here or at the bottom of the shoulder and trigger buttons themselves, and that would also dampen the sound too. So you could definitely make this a little bit quieter with some tape. I'll leave the tape that I'm talking about linked down below. Okay, so let's put together everything that I like and I dislike about the PowKiddy V90S to kind of steer us in the right direction of whether or not this is worth that $40 price point. Number one, I think this is a pretty solid build, especially from PowKiddy, who is known for making some pretty cheap feeling handhelds. And the build quality also extends to the hinge, which mimics the Game Boy Advance SP as well as the Anbernic RG35XX SP. I think it's a solid hinge. The controls here are also decent. The D-pad feels a little bit mushy, but overall when it comes to actually playing games, I think it's fine. The OS experience is also very simple and intuitive once you get over that hurdle of actually adding your games. Once that's set up, yeah, I think it's going to be a pretty easy device to get in and out of your favorite games with. I also think that a starting price of $40 is pretty darn good. You have to bear in mind that, 6 months, a year from now, you'll probably be able to find it for even cheaper. So I love the fact that they are really going for that budget-minded price. Now, at that budget price point, there are going to be some shortcomings. So let's talk about some of the things I don't like about the V90S. And number one is the fact that it lacks some key features. For example, it does not have onboard Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or HDMI out, which you can find on other devices that are of a similar quality. It also lacks a headphone jack, which for me is just kind of a weird choice because this is a handheld for me that screams that it should be played with earphones just to really complete that 90s or 2000s feel. I was also surprised to find how loud the start and select buttons were. Everything else is very quiet on this device by comparison, and so this may be something that might bother you over time like it did for me. And then finally, the last feature I don't really like about the V90S is that when you close it up, it doesn't automatically go to sleep like the other handhelds. That's one of my favorite things about a clamshell, just how intuitive it is when you close it and it actually shuts down. So when it comes down to it, the V90S is a pretty cheap handheld and pretty solid in the hand, but it lacks a bunch of features. It cut a lot of corners to basically get to that price point. So things like HDMI, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, as well as a headphone jack, and even the ability to close it and actually go into sleep, those might all be deal breakers for you. But I could see for some people those not being that big of a deal. For example, if you wanted an offline device, this is going to have it. So it really does come back to the phrase that I said at the beginning of this video, and that PowKiddy devices are often a little bit cheaper, but also a little bit worse. And like with other devices from this company, it's got some trade-offs, and you have to decide whether or not those trade-offs are worth that lower price point. So the way I see it, there are three main reasons to get this handheld. Number one is going to be the fact that you want something very cheap. $40 or less is going to be an excellent starting price for something that really is a very decent gaming experience. I also think for this price point, we are getting some decent controls. They are limited by the lack of analog sticks for certain systems, but when it comes to just your standard retro gaming, it's going to be an excellent fit. And then finally, there are some fun color options. I think these two are pretty decent, but that red or orange color option looks really fun too. So for me, this is the type of handheld I would give to a kid. Somebody that's around maybe 8 or 10 years old. They don't really know any better, but they want something that they can play Game Boy games on. This is going to be a simple experience. Now, there are a couple things you'd have to tell that kid. For example, you can't just close it up and it's going to go to sleep and turn off. You'll have to teach them how to tap that power button ahead of time. But those are little things, and I think at that age, it's probably a good fit. Another option would be, to give this away as gifts. For example, you've got a friend who doesn't really know anything about this stuff, but you want to get them something really cheap that has a really kind of nostalgic feeling to it. This will be pretty good in that regard too. I'll also let you in on a secret. If you don't put any Nintendo 64 games on this, then your friends aren't going to know that it can play Nintendo 64, and that's going to save you the headache of explaining why there's no analog stick on it and why they can't play their favorite game. So instead, just load it up with your favorites, hand it off to them, and they're going to have a lot of fun when it comes to playing retro D-pad centric games. Anyway, that's my take on the V90S. I think that it's a decent handheld for the price, but if you pay a little bit more, you're going to get a lot more features. Now, we still don't have that perfect clamshell handheld just yet, but it is nice to see that on the low end, we still have something very decent. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.